Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the third hour of the David Knight Show. Harrison Smith sitting in for David Knight. This might be, if all things go to plan, if all things go well, this will be my last week hosting the show. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I've thoroughly enjoyed hearing from you, the InfoWars audience, and I will thoroughly enjoy starting to sleep in past 4 a.m. in the morning. I will return to that life and let David take back over this the reins here at the David Knight Show. So I think we're all looking forward to that and getting his voice back on the radio. Now, in this last hour, my guest, very special guest, Hamamoto, Professor Daryl Hamamoto, former professor at the University of California, focuses a lot on the underlying causes of what we're seeing in the world. You see the surface level. Well, now we're about to go a little bit deeper. Thank you so much, Professor Hamamoto, for joining me here today.
Thank you so much, Harrison, for the invitation. And you've been doing a wonderful job. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I've tried my best.
Oh, you've done great. I'm sure the listeners will agree. I also wanted to congratulate Greg Reese for that brilliant report, the one on
good, isn't he?
The mafiosa Nancy Pelosi of the Pacific Heights Mafia. I think you referred to her as being a member of, because what Greg is doing, what you're doing, what Alex Jones has been doing for over 20 years is digging deeper into the biography, the history, the backstory, if you will, of these miscreants who run our lives, who rule our world. And if you dig a little bit, even slightly, but the deeper the better, of course, but even if you dig in slightly, you will delegitimize their claim to political office, their claim to power, their claim to leadership. So let's all us listeners here around the world, within the United States, globally, let's each do similar types of research, biographical metadata, if you will. And by doing that, we will be able to understand this larger system that you alluded to earlier, that is the foundation of this new world order, which is in truth an old world order built on very, very old occultic principles, ideas, beliefs, and practices, which I hope we can delve into today when we talk about AOC, otherwise known as Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're exactly right. You scratch the surface and just Satanism spills out all over the place. So I mean, there's so many different angles to approach with this. And, one thing you said that really, struck a chord with me right there is the idea that these people are not, they don't have a right to rule over us. And they're portraying it as if they do by making it seem like it is a meritocracy, if you will. They say, well, I was elected, or well, this or that. But then you look into it and you go, okay, now hold on. All the people that are hosting television shows are married to or are the daughters or sons of, famous New World Order operatives or politicians. They're all married together. It's all one big network, and you're not in it. That's what George Carlin used to say. So, just what are you seeing as sort of the biggest threat? My reading of this, and I've said it before on the show, is that they're seeing their power threatened, and so they're doubling down right now. Is this the same pattern that you recognize going on, and how do we deal with this?
Yes, over and over again, whether it's in politics, show business. I think the exception to that is sports, which is about as close to a true meritocracy as we can get. But the people, the fields of endeavor that you just mentioned are connected by these tightly bound social networks. We see this in just taking a look at who Christine Blasey Ford is, going back into her high school years. And you see that the tentacles of her family interconnect with this, what I can see is the Northeastern establishment, which has now migrated and settled into the Silicon Valley area. And that's why someone like Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein are so critical to this process. And now the newly elected governor of the state of California, Gavin Newsom, the power center has shifted into this area. The Netflix mafia, right? Silicon Valley, and its southerly neighbor, Hollywood, and they're beginning to merge now. They're fusing. Netflix arguably is producing better content now, as they like to call it, than Hollywood is. And I have to tip my hat to them. They are producing some pretty good independent documentaries, which ironically reveals the inner workings of their IT world. So we could use the information that the open source information that these entities provide to us, but we have to have an overarching conceptual or a theoretical model or grid in which to connect all these different data points. And for that purpose, I've been working on for the last several years on something called New World Order theory. And a lot of it comes from outlier type knowledge, whether it's research in the occult, which was never really accepted in academia. I think it was consciously pushed out, especially by the psychology mafia. People like G. Stanley Hall, who invited Sigmund Freud, to the United States, and that group there, and Carl Jung, people of that ilk, they invited him to the United States, and they said, we are going to pursue this historically based occult elite agenda, but we're going to call it psychology. We're going to call it behavioral science later on, and put this mask of rationality over this rotten, necrotic face of occult knowledge and behavior and wisdom and control, political, economic control. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comes right out of this tradition, and nowhere is this articulated better than a recent essay by my friend and colleague Yoichi Shimatsu in an article on Rense.com titled Cult Luminary Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Diabolical Deceits. And he concludes with the observation that in times past, characters like her were outside the political system. They moved the Overton window over in their direction, but never were they able to be right at the core of political power on a national level. In addition to that, she also represents the new face of the utopian socialist millennial generation, who, as we know by the data, has a stranglehold on young people in academia and probably within the high school ranks. But the utopian socialism is the dominant ideology in the 2-year and the 4-year colleges and universities in the United States, in Britain, and probably a lot of the Western institutions such as this. Utopian socialism with a twist, with a major twist. And this is where IT comes in. This is where Silicon Valley and the hallucinati come in. And that is that it's all going to be controlled by this, as Alex Jones has been talking about for years now, through so-called artificial intelligence, virtual reality, enhanced reality. And this is why there's so much, and I think it was during the Obama administration that this initiative was passed and funded, but it's now neuroscience. Right. Because there's tons of money taking MK Ultra and multiplying by a factor of millions and learning how these neural process, neuropsychiatry, how it operates, and they're getting very close. And Netflix, again, is beginning to present to us these predictive programming, normalizing type movies like Black Mirror, like Maniac, which is previewing and acclimating the new generation, even before the millennial generation, the children of today. They are normalizing and acclimating them to this new world order, this new AI world order. Just as the science fiction of the 30s and 40s and 50s created a generation of technicians, scientists, and researchers who formed the basis of the new biology, space exploration, and computer science. I'm sure Ray Kurzweil, people like that, were avid readers of Isaac Asimov, who, by the way, was a professor himself. Yeah. Well,
and see, this is what happens is we have so many data points all over the place, and they all connect. And if you aren't already aware of this, This is the problem that Alex Jones runs into. He has all this information in his head. He sounds like he's crazy because you don't realize that all these things, they're all true and they all interconnect. And only after hours and hours and decades of research does it all make sense. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm back with my guest for the hour. I wasn't sure if he was going to be able to stay the whole hour, but there's no way we'll be able to cover all this bombshell information in any time less than that. So I am inviting him here now to stay on for the full hour and really delve deeply into some of these topics that we're discussing. There's, of course, Professor Daryl Hamamoto, formerly of the University of California in UC Davis. Now, that's Northern California, my crew tells me, and reminds me that you are within proximity, Professor, of the Bohemian Grove, where, of course, Alex Jones blew the lid off of the weird occultic satanic, worshiping Moloch and these weird ancient child sacrifice gods and performing faux sacrifices there, together as a strange occult view. And so some people see this and they go, yeah, so what? It's politicians. They're being a little weird. I think if you have a rational bone in your body and you really think about what you're seeing, you're thinking about the most powerful people in the world dressing up and pretending to worship an ancient god of child sacrifice, that should worry you no matter what. But then that extends to things like spirit cooking with the Podestas and the Clintons involved in this weird, again, satanic sort of action. And again, I get people arguing with me and saying, yeah, so what? It's just a little fun. It's a little bit of performance art. Who cares? Correct them, Professor Hamamoto. Let them know why we need to focus on the strange occultic underpinnings of what the New World Order and the elites are getting up to.
Harrison, that is such a hopelessly naive perspective. It's very limited, and more importantly, it's dangerous. Because in this article that I alluded to earlier by Yoichi Shimatsu, he claims, and I know this because I know his research, I know him personally, he's a thorough forensic journalist. He's also a graduate, by the way, of the Berkeley School of Journalism. He's been the editor of the Japan Times, the English language edition. So his bona fides are impeccable. But he makes the point there, while he himself does not believe in any occult principles, and neither do I, he feels it's important to understand their worldview, because in his reportage on the sarin gas Om Shinrikyo cult, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but this happened in the 90s. But there was an attack at multiple points in the subways in Tokyo by this cult led by Asahara Shoko called Om Shinrikyo, or Om cult. But he was able to look at their theology, their occult ideas, and piece them together and understand that their agenda was to unleash this gas, this sarin nerve gas, which was developed during the Third Reich, by the way. And one wonders how they were able to develop it. And most of them, by the way, were graduates of elite universities, such as the University of Tokyo. So when we're talking about this, keep in mind that the universities are front and center when we're dealing with the New World Order. And that includes Ocasio-Cortez, who we'll talk about in a moment. But the point is, Harrison, to your question, whether we agree with these or understand or subscribe to these belief systems or not is irrelevant. They believe in it, they subscribe to them, and they act upon them. So we can read their own writings, we could look at their own figures, we can study their own predictive programming via Netflix, and we can defend and attack accordingly. We will understand their way, we will use our way, the way of goodness and rectitude, in order to defeat them. But we have to get into the minds, the behavior of the enemy. And the people who attend the Bohemian Club, Bohemian Grove rituals make no mistake about it, they are the enemy. And that's just one group. There are any number of interlocking secret societies, including a world of secret societies among African American elites that most people did not know about until a public grassroots neighborhood public intellectual by the name of Steve Coakley, and he's passed on. he uncovered the connection between the elite African American handlers for the New World Order. It's centered upon a fraternity called Sigma Pi Phi. And some of you have seen these movies about stepping, or as we
Yeah.
say in America, steppin', but for your
Right.
international audience, stepping. That is an occult induction ritual for these elite African American fraternities that are based in the historically Black colleges like Morehouse, like Spelman College. Now, who was the founder of Spelman College? It was none other than Laura Spelman Rockefeller.
Mm.
And it was for women of the African, or back then they were called Negro, the Negro elite females, because they decided early on that the Black African male was to be subjugated and the mammy system was going to be institutionalized, and we we're going to educate them and let their men go from slavery into becoming the new industrial proletariat working for
Right.
the Rockefeller combines. So
Right.
it was Laura Spelman Rockefeller who is the engine, the motor, the financier of some of these Black historical colleges. She's just one. There are many now,
Wow.
including George Soros, I imagine.
Yeah, that's
So,
amazing. And
yeah.
you see really clearly, I think, in fraternities and sororities, the marriage that you talked about last segment of occult and psychological manipulation, and how intertwined they are, and how they have exactly the same principles, just under a scientific or sort of spiritual terms, but they're the same things, and it's about, control of the mind, and whether you define it spiritually or define it science, it's the same thing. And you find a marriage of that in fraternities where they're doing things that are, seemingly or on a surface sort of occultic, but they have underpinnings that are based in psychology and based in, the destruction of the self, so you can build up the group and all this sort of stuff. So can you talk about that for the last minute here of this segment?
Oh, absolutely. This is in the modern ages. This science of behavior was inaugurated by Auguste Comte, whose statue sits in the Place de la Sorbonne in Paris. Right. So we have these sociologists and psychologists who are trying to figure out, what do we do with the proletariat? What do we do with the riffraff? They've been studying us for generations, and now it seems like we're reaching the end point with the AI. It's all
Mm.
going to be automated now, because this whole science of here's an ontology here of social dominance, which, and there's an extensive literature here, is now being brought into its end game by people with yellow faces, brown faces, and black faces, right?
Right.
And it was almost 5 years ago that I introduced on InfoWars with Alex Jones this notion of weaponized multiculturalism. And Ocasio-Cortez is the embodiment of this idea that I articulated almost 5 years ago. And they are beginning to attain political power. And ladies and gentlemen, if we allow this to come to pass, not the fact that they are of these particular groups, it doesn't matter. If you are an American and if your heart is in favor of the American Republic and the principles that founded this experiment, this social, this political, economic, cultural experiment called the United States of America, then that's fine. That's great.
Yeah,
But
then
we
you
have to be very
automatically are against this identitarianism. I mean, if you believe in Americanism, this is repulsive to you, what's going on with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. On the other side, we will get right in to AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the demonic forces that are secretly driving her. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Harrison Smith sitting in for David Knight, my guest is Professor Daryl Hamamoto. We're talking about the occult underpinnings behind what the elite are getting up to. This ties in directly to his current project of outlining the principles of the New World Order theory, and just how academia plays into this and is sort of the main battleground that these intellectual information wars are being fought. Now, let's talk. We've talked about her a couple times, or at least we've mentioned her name, but let's really get into Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I'm just going to hand the floor over to you, but I just want to say first that one of the main sort of breaks I see between socialists and our side, the I don't even want to say the right wing, because that brings up all sorts of bad connotations, but towards the freedom side, the liberty side. A big difference I see is that socialists stop at the money. They say this person's doing this for money, and then they stop. Where I go a step farther is I say, no, you don't understand. The people involved in this have all the money. They literally print money. They have all the money they could possibly want. They have more than they could ever need. So it's not about money. Money to them is a tool to get power. And that, at least to me, helps put in perspective some of what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is doing and why seemingly she's so against billionaires and millionaires and yet has the full backing of the same people she's claiming to be fighting against. So am I reading that somewhat correctly, or help put me on the right footing, Professor Daryl Hamamoto?
You are correct, Mr. Smith. Are you ready to
Excellent.
go in on AOC?
Please do. At your
All
lead.
right. She's evil. Say it with me, evil.
Evil. La
Great.
Chupacabra is what I
Say
call her.
evil, like Christopher Lee.
Yes.
Let's give it the British pronunciation. It sounds like evil instead of evil. All right. This is an insight again that I'm drawing from my friend Yoichi, but the dimension of bastardy, which I'd like to allude to before we go into the Howard Thurman Center, whence she arises, where she was groomed to become AOC. But I note here from the Shimatsu article that her father, supposed father, Sergio Ocasio, who's an architect, I wonder if he's a Freemason, but he's an architect by profession. She bears zero resemblance to her supposed pappy, who she does look like is the partner of Sergio Ocasio, and the guy's name is Kirschenbaum, and he's involved in New York state politics. He might really be the engine behind the rise of AOC. And so what Yoichi has done is he traced that background. Well, first of all, that would make her a legitimate individual, a bastard, as we call it, or as the Supremes call it, a love child, right? And that's important, not because of bastardy, because there's tons of very decent bastards out there, but the real dangerous ones are people like William Jefferson Clinton, or Jeff One-Eye Bezos, right? Or Steve Jobs. These people who get into power, they have a sort of a sketchy type of parentage there, which they can, and apparently it's common amongst the nobility to the point where they would have these carriages and these family crests of the bastard line of the family, and the crest would be slightly tilted askance to show them they're not quite within the royal bloodlines there. But anyway, Yoichi Shimatsu traces the Kirschbaum and the Kirschenbaum family back to Bavaria, which is the heartland of German Rosicrucianism. And most of your above intelligence audience will know that when you talk about German Rosicrucians, you talk about Bavaria, you're dealing with the Bavarian Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Freemasons, Freemasons.
Yeah,
and you're talking about all these different lodges, and you're ranging into the latter day Nazi occultism. So all we independent researchers need to do is start digging further into her background and this connection, just as they're doing to President Donald Trump, because we know in basketball that a pressing team doesn't like to be pressed. So we, as researchers, need to impose the full court press on these people, including one of their stars right now, AOC. And by the way, she does have a planetary object named after her, thanks to her connections at MIT. I think she had an asteroid named after her with a certain sort of numerical designation, which has numerological significance as well. So she, as a public figure, I think we could perhaps launch her, and we don't need to wait for the government. We can do it ourselves, right? We could launch our own public ethics investigation of AOC to ask questions about this nepotism, about her falsified biographical record, about scientific fraud in MIT, giving her this asteroid designation. And we should also, very, very importantly, ask about the hidden sources of her financial support. And on another level as well, I think, why has not anybody asked AOC her position on abortion, on legalized institutionalized murder, which has recently been legislated into existence in her state of New York? Just ask the simple question. The next press conference or the next Twitter feed, whatever it might be, put the question to AOC herself. Now, let me return to the university connection, because as I've told you, the university, from the times of the medieval period to the contemporary to the modern period, the university has been the wellsprings of these ideas, the knowledge bases, which on the one hand could liberate humankind, but on the other are used to control, suppress, and even exterminate large segments of humanity. AOC hung out at a center called the Howard Thurman Center, and it was named after a African-American clergyman. I think he was born in Florida, but his pastorship took him to Georgia. And of course, he passed through the Spelman College or Morehouse College, right? It's one of the historically Black colleges which are controlled by financiers, right? They want to take the agriculturally based slave population and turn them to urban proletariat and keep them in permanent bondage in that setting, controlled by families like the Rockefellers. Anyway, AOC used to hang out at the Howard Thurman Center. This is where she was groomed. And your younger listeners who are in college and university right now, you know that there's one of these types of places on your campus. These days, it's called the Cross-Cultural Center or the Multicultural Center or the Safe Space of the University of Georgia, whatever it might be. It serves the same function. One is to identify individuals like AOC or people who have been referred to them, or to see prospects come through and pass certain tests, right? Trustworthiness, sleaziness, ratability, all these undesirable human characteristics, and then put them forward. So who was Howard Thurman? And this is where it connects to the hallucinati of Silicon Valley. This is where it connects to even someone like Ted Kaczynski, who was as an undergraduate at Harvard University, was subjected to really heavy-duty undergraduate LSD, hallucinogenic psychology, mind control experiments. And he writes about this. There's a really great book by Alston Chase called Harvard and the Unabomber that goes into that in great detail. So it's not me that's saying this. There's literature on the situation. Well, anyway, Howard Thurman, as a clergyman, held a weekly set of experiments. It was called the Good Friday experiments, and this, or sometimes in the literature, and you can look this up independently, viewers and listeners, it's called the Marsh Chapel experiment. And it's also called the Good Friday experiment. It was held in 1962, and who presided over this? It was none other than our friend, Pastor Thurman. So he was involved with psilocybin, hallucinogenics, and of course, as you know, the Thurman Center and AOC comes out of Boston University.
It's incredible. It's incredible. I got to stop you there. We got to go to break. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. It is amazing, folks, just how deep the rabbit hole goes. We were talking earlier in this segment about just how early on in life, myself and people like me were, quote unquote, red pilled or whatever you want to call it. You find out the truth and you start searching. And you would think after, literally decades of research that you would have a pretty good handle on everything that's going on. And then along comes somebody like Professor Daryl Hamamoto that puts your knowledge to shame. I'm taking notes. I have been this whole hour. I hope you are too. Hope you have a notepad ready to jot down some of these names and groups and dates that Professor Daryl Hamamoto is going over, because these are the data points that you need to understand, and you need to take these in. And once you get these, you can back up and see the whole picture for everything that is reality out there. So once again, I just sort of hand it over to Professor Daryl Hamamoto as we continue to talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her occult links all the way back to the Illuminati that was founded in, I believe, the 17th century in Bavaria, where they decided that by using academia and knowledge and by controlling the flow of information, they could take over the world. And if you really look into it, in my opinion, what they learned was that they can, in fact, achieve the promise that was promised to Eve by the serpent in the Garden of Eden of extended life, infinite life, of becoming gods on earth. And this is the power that they truly seek. And they see psychology and academia and science as a way of achieving that very occult desire. So that's my personal reading of it. Professor Hamamoto, are you sort of in the same vein as me, or are you on a whole nother level that I'm not even aware of?
No, we're on the same track. Absolutely,
Okay.
Mr. Smith. And thank you for your kind compliments. Maybe we can have a pay-per-view seminar and
We'll have
turn
to
the
do this again
proceeds
very
over to
soon.
Roger. Pardon me?
We'll have to do this again very soon. This has been incredibly informative and enjoyable.
Then we can turn the proceeds over to the Roger Stone Legal Defense Fund. He's a fine man and a great patriot. I just wanted to express my support for his courage. And millions of Americans and people around the world support him and the unjust terroristic raid on his home the other day, scaring his wife and his pets. So we support him fully. It's all part of the same struggle here. But anyway, returning back to AOC here, there was a 39-year-old research psychologist by the name of Timothy Leary who was vacationing in the summer of 1960 in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and he happened to take some magic mushrooms. And suppose, and this is the story, whether it's true or not, who knows, but that's the legend. And so he took these insights back to his home institution, which is Harvard University. Mm-hmm. And Harvard, and from there, most of your viewers know the story, how he dropped acid with his students, undergraduates. And there was some, whispering amongst the faculty, but he got away with it for a little while. And some of his experimentation caught the attention of some of the social elite, like Mary Pinchot Meyer, for example. She was married to Cord Meyer of the CIA. And Mary Pinchot Meyer famously became the girlfriend or mistress, if you will, of John F. Kennedy. And supposedly they got high together and maybe even dropped some acid. So you see how the tentacles out of Harvard were spreading not just through the counterculture, but to the very highest reaches of the government. Anyway, this psychologist at Harvard started this, it's called the Harvard Psilocybin Project, psilocybin after the extract from the magic mushrooms from Mexico. And Boston University is right on the other side of the River Charles. And Alpert's research assistants, PhD doctoral students, and by the way, there's heavy indoctrination and mind control amongst the professionals who are in training. You don't get to go to the next step unless you buy in totally and make your bones. You're not admitted into the club unless you do abide by this. Anyway, one of his assistants, Timothy Leary's assistants, reached out to the Pastor Thurman here over at Boston University. And from there, the hallucinogenic drug cult began to spread from the Boston area all the way to the West Coast, and of course started to piggyback and intersect with the emerging counterculture, which I think was probably organic, but then eventually was hijacked and steered in certain unhealthy directions. And by the way, an outgrowth of that is the Silicon Valley complex.
Right.
Or originators of that were visionaries themselves and part of this. But they later repudiated because they had people like Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs starting to appear, and the likes of Bill Gates. And then it became part of the larger control complex. So it started off with intentions.
If I can interject here, I see the 60s as a time similar to 2016 or nowadays, where there was a groundswell of resistance, a groundswell of anti-establishmentism that threatened to sweep the whole thing away, and then it was infiltrated and turned on its head, sort of. So almost in a way, it served the system rather than being a threat to it. It's a threat that we find ourselves now under as this movement threatens to be turned away. But do you see the 60s as that pivotal time where we could have gone, and used that counterculture revolution to actually change things for the better, but instead it was hijacked and redirected?
Oh, absolutely. The 1960s, the mid 1960s particularly, and on are pivotal, not just in American civilizational history, but in world history. And there are elements within it that I would argue we need to return to it, and we need to restore their original intention. And they're very useful to 2019 in the battle against genetically modified organisms, in the battle against these recombinant DNA experiments that are going on at all the Research One institutions. The counterculture was on this. They were into foods and nutrition. An institution like Chez Panisse in Berkeley embodied that communal aesthetic of eating real food, not out of a can, not out of Swanson's TV dinner, which we were fed during the 1950s, or Chef Boyardee spaghetti out of a can. And there were all these revolutionary currents going in. You can understand how this would prove to be a menace or a direct threat to the white shoe boys, the financiers of Wall Street, who wanted to commodify everything, right down to the food that we eat. Our blood, our DNA, our genetics are now commodified. And it was the counterculture and its music and its publications, even in the early days of Rolling Stone, before Jan Wenner was co-opted at a certain point. This was all very healthy and robust and lively. And I'm saying this because there's a whole wing right now that says everything out of the 60s was controlled. Pop music, rock music was a CIA creation, and that's all it was. No, in part it was. But there was a liberatory aspect of the 1960s that we need to re-examine and look at clear-eyed and focused, and separate that from the controlled Andres Puharich, the Stanford Research Institute iteration of the consciousness revolution, if you will.
Yeah. No,
does that make sense?
Absolutely. And of course, you see, when you look back at that whole age, you see the Timothy Leary tied in with Allen Ginsberg, and I mean, it all the beat poets turned into the hippies, and I mean, there are real movements, and then there are the people that those movements threaten, who come in and hijack the movements. I would even throw back to Occupy Wall Street as a great example of a modern version of that, where think what you will about them at the time. I was pretty much in favor. I knew about Occupy Wall Street before it happened, and all their goals and everything were very good and solid. And then they got infiltrated by radical leftists, and the whole thing fell apart. And now it has this terrible reputation. But it's the same thing that happened in the 60s. Now, in the last minute or so, Professor Hamamoto, I would love to have you back as soon as possible just to continue this conversation. But for those who have not gotten enough of you yet, how do people find you? How can they find your work?
Well, I have a public Facebook page on, it's called Professor Hamamoto, appropriately enough, and the public is invited to look at my postings. I post information, a lot of from InfoWars, by the way, on a regular basis. I also have a YouTube channel that's called Professor Hamamoto. I do some original work, but I do mostly edited commentary. For example, I did a review of the founder of the brains behind Chez Panisse in Berkeley by the name of Jeremiah Tower. And I talk about his early childhood sexual abuse and certain problems that he endured in the hands of this elite socialization. A lot of it, by the way, has to do with homosexual abuse and trauma.
Oh my gosh, we could do
this can be another discussion.
We could do a whole show on that. We'll have to have you back as a regular guest to get into all of this. Okay. Your knowledge is clearly unparalleled and puts mine to shame. Thank you so much, Daryl Hamamoto. Alex Jones coming up next. Go to InfoWarsStore.com to support this broadcast. Thank you so much, Professor.
We need to go back and revisit the foundations of our freedom. Our freedoms don't consist of the things that are enumerated on a piece of paper. It consists of the things that we're willing to fight for. The First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the rest of the Bill of Rights are prohibitions. They're prohibitions against powerful organizations and individuals taking those God-given rights from us as individuals. You better understand that, because they're taking them right now. We have seen what they want to do. They called it UN Agenda 21. Now they call it the UN 2030 Agenda. They want everybody off of the rural lands. They want people out of the suburbs. They want to pack everybody into the cities, because that's where it is easiest for them to control everyone.
miss your show any day. I mean, never.